yeah, you are, let's see, you are at, which I should have been.
It's either Ohio, Idaho, or Iowa.
Iowa is the one that I have on the correspondence of the papers here.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
Hello, welcome to Science Sort of. This is the show that talks about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science. Our theme this episode is Stung by the Truth. You're going to see why that is in just a moment, because I'm your host, Ryan, and joining me on this episode, it's the triumphant return of one Kelly Wienersmith.
Hello! It's good to be back. It's been a long time. Life has been crazy.
It sure has. And I'm ready for a break. But hopefully we can get a break by talking about all things wasps with our new friend, Dr. Andrew Forbes. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Hello. Thanks for having me. Life has been crazy here, too.
So, Andrew, yeah, you are, let's see, you're in the Department of Biology at the University of Iowa in Iowa City, Iowa. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, it's a lot of Iowa in one affiliation. Well, tell us a little bit about your background. We have a couple of papers we want to dive into that you have worked on with your stuff regarding wasps. But I think before we do that, just a quick little overview of your academic history up to the point where you're at now. And I guess also included in that story is how you got to know Kelly.
Sure. So I went to college at Colgate University in upstate New York and learned just sort of general biology. I got a biology degree and a minor in philosophy as well. And then I met my wife in my junior year, my future wife in my junior year, and she decided she was going to go to grad school. So I followed her and I went to the University of Notre Dame and got a degree in evolutionary biology working with the great Jeff Fader, who is an evolutionary biologist there who studies sort of the origin of species and had been working for many years on something called sympatric speciation. You guys know what that is?
I mean, I know yes, we've talked about it on the show before. I think I'm a sympatric speciation atheist, if that's a thing. Like, I don't believe, I've yet to be convinced that it's a thing. But briefly for the audience, sympatric speciation is when a lineage splits into two or more separate species without a geographic or other separating barrier between the two populations from being able to breed with each other.
That's right. And so a very controversial question for about 20, 30 years in evolutionary biology. These days, people usually talk about the role of ecology in leading to speciation and not so much on the allopatric versus sympatric thing. But in any case,
I feel like I've read so many papers on lakes in Africa with a bunch of cichlids and then being like, no, look, it's two species. And I'm like, yeah, but they're in different parts of the lake. Like,
that's right. That's right. So in Fader's lab, we were working on these flies that had shifted over to laying their eggs in apples. And apples, of course, were introduced to the United States by Europeans about 200 years ago. And so Fader's group had shown that, and also Guy Bush before him had shown that these flies were splitting into two different species as a result of being associated with different fruits. So without any geographic isolation, that's how it fits into that story. And while I was there, I studied wasps, these parasitic wasps, that laid their eggs into the flies that were laying their eggs into the apples and the ancestral host, the hawthorn. And so I got into parasites then and have kind of never left. I'm really excited about how new species of parasitic wasps form and just sort of wasp diversity generally. You also asked how Kelly and I came to know each other. So yeah. Scott Egan, who's a professor at Rice, works on many different things, but one system are these oak gall wasps, and he recruited me to look at parasitic wasps in the oak gall wasp system, a system that I expect we'll talk a lot about today. And so Kelly was also working in that system, and we've published several papers together now, although we've never actually met in person. So that's how we know each other.
Yeah, pandemics have a weird way of quashing our ability to travel around and meet new cool people in the real world.
But pre-pandemic, we weren't able to meet in real life either. But it's incredible. I think if you had asked me, right before I started working with Scott Egan, if you had told me, Kelly, you're going to get excited about wasps, I would have been like, that seems pretty unlikely. But turns out wasps are actually pretty awesome. And now I am also hooked.
So, Andrew, another question we like to start our discussions off with. You mentioned studying evolution, but you also mentioned wasps and you mentioned parasitism. What kind of scientist do you identify as these days? Do you consider yourself an evolutionary biologist? Do you consider yourself a parasitologist?
Not a parasitologist. I think that term, I feel like that term's reserved for people who study, I don't know, parasites of vertebrates. I don't know why, but that's where all that literature seems to be focused. So, and Kelly probably knows a lot more about that than me. I would say evolutionary biologist.
Yeah, I'll note that yes, parasitologist usually refers to people who study helminth parasites, so like tapeworms, trematodes, stuff like that. But we're trying to be a much more welcoming group. So I'm currently president of the Helminthological Society of Washington, and our motto is "It's not just about worms anymore." And so I go to our talks. And I talk about parasitoid wasps, so we're all welcome. It's a big net.
Yeah, it feels similar to how I sometimes get called an entomologist, but I feel like I can't call myself that because I never even took a class in entomology. It feels like a club that I don't belong to.
Right. So why would an evolutionary biologist need a class on where words come from?
Yeah, right. Yeah. I am an etymologist, I would say.
That's true, because you are naming species.
Sure, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Oh, the entomologist who wasn't. I love that. That's great. So you mentioned we have two papers that we're going to be talking about today. The first paper was published in 2018 in BMC Ecology, Quantifying the Unquantifiable, Why Hymenoptera, not Coleoptera, is the most speciose animal order. And if you don't know what that title means, don't worry, we're going to get into it. If you do know what that title means, you are probably agog in shock at such a bold claim. And you mentioned, Andrew, in the beginning that, one of the labs you're in studied the origin of species. Well, I would say that Charles Darwin, sir, would have, and especially Darwin's bulldog, would have some strong words in response to hearing that title. So do you want to, one thing we often ask authors of papers to do is if they use any scientific terminology in the title of the paper to sort of break down what the title of the paper is saying in sort of layman's terms.
Sure. Well, I can do that quickly, and then I can give you a little bit of the history here behind it, and maybe include Darwin as well. So the paper, as you said, is Quantifying the Unquantifiable, Why Hymenoptera, not Coleoptera, is the most speciose animal order. Basically, all we're saying in that title is that there are more wasps than beetles. There are more species of wasps than there are species of beetle. And that is a claim that got some people in a real bother. People were not happy that we published that in some areas, in part because there's been this belief for a really long time that beetles are the most species-rich group of animals on Earth, or at least the most species-rich order of animals.
And that's the Coleoptera. So since we were joking about etymology, Coleoptera is sheathed wing. So that literally is because beetles have a shell over their wing. Hymenoptera is membrane wing, and Hymenoptera includes bees, wasps, hornets, and ants.
And ants, yeah. And that's, I should say, I did not know the etymology of either of those words. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Brian, did you look that up or did you know that off the top of your head?
Hymenoptera I knew off the top of my head. Coleoptera I had to look up.
Impressive.
I didn't know that the Greek koleos is a sheath. So.
Sheath, cool. Okay. So people have believed this for a really long time, that there are more beetles than anything else. And in part, that's because of people like Darwin, who back in his day, like he and like all the other landed gentle people would go out and collect beetles as a hobby and then kind of get together and compare the size of their beetle collections and see whose was bigger, right? So as a result, there are all these really good taxonomic resources for beetles. And that's true for only a couple of other groups of insects like Lepidoptera, which are also, so the butterflies and moths, which are also really charismatic and pretty and easy to collect.
Scale wing, I think. I'm not looking that one up. I'm pretty sure that's scale wing.
I think you're right about that one, yes. And so basically for many years, we've just had really good collection records, really good taxonomic resources for Coleoptera, and not so much for the Hymenoptera, and especially the smallest of the Hymenoptera, which are the parasitic wasps, which are these tiny little wasps, often almost as small as a period at the end of a sentence, that lay their eggs into the bodies of other insects and then kind of eat the bodies of those insects and then explode horribly out like an alien. And so we just haven't had resources to study these, and people, as a consequence, have not, fully explored their diversity, and it's still pretty hard to do that.
So somehow we wound up in a situation where the things that are bigger, prettier, and easier to catch were counted better than the tiny, stinging, horrible horror movie insect.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. And
they're not so horrible.
They're not horrible at all. But most people, when we describe their life histories, do kind of cringe, including all the members of my family. So it's, yeah, they're not well loved. And yeah, you also study parasites, Kelly, so you're probably used to that as well.
Yeah, I don't get invited to dinner with people very often.
No.
Well, Kelly and I often joke on this show, as the two more biology-focused people, is that like when biologists are talking amongst themselves, it is only a matter of time before the conversation gets to sex or poop. It's bound to happen. And to touch back on the joke I made about Darwin's bulldog, I was referring to Haldane, one of the earliest and loudest proponents of Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection. And there's this, you mentioned it in the paper, this apocryphal tale that he was asked, what can we know of the creator of God based on the life we see on Earth? And he supposedly responded with, he must have an inordinate fondness for beetles, just because it was so prevalent, this idea that there were just tons and tons of beetles out there. And I mean, it sounds like Andrew, this argument is you're not taking away any of the diversity of beetles, you're just expanding the diversity of Hymenoptera.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely more described species of beetle than any other kind of insect, for sure. Again, because of these taxonomic resources. So we know that there are hundreds of thousands of beetle species on Earth. We just haven't been able to study the wasps in the same way, and so we don't have those records yet. So yeah, definitely not taking away from the huge diversity of beetles, just saying that there's a lot of wasps out there that we haven't found yet. And I think that's okay. That's great.
This may be a bigger question than we really want to get into, but just sort of in your mind or in your experience, I know this is an issue in paleontology, is that it's actually hard to get funded to do just like straight taxonomy work. Is that an issue in entomology or evolutionary biology as well?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. And I should say we don't really do a lot of taxonomy in our lab, but whenever we've tried to publish a paper like this one, we've made it clear that one of the big barriers is a lack of funding or a very low amount of funding for taxonomy. If that were improved, if we were training taxonomists, especially in Hymenoptera taxonomy, that would help the problem. We'd be able to start describing more of these species more rapidly.
No, I actually think we're approaching a crisis point in all life sciences from a lack of trained taxonomists in the next generation. I think it's going to be a real problem.
It's a major problem, especially with the diversity crisis right now.
Do you think anything's going to happen to fix it, or you think are we just in a lot of trouble?
I haven't seen anybody taking any action to fix it. I've seen a lot of researchers say that this is going to be a problem, including some people who are, relatively prominent in their fields. I had a conversation with the then director of the La Selva Research Station in Costa Rica about this. He was giving me a ride to the airport, so we had time to talk. And I mean, he runs a facility that, according to his own statistics, roughly a paper gets published every 72 hours on stuff happening at La Selva. And even he was worried about this upcoming taxonomy crisis. I think he also did a lot of insect work. So I think I talked about this a lot actually when I was doing my science policy gig, in that, I would have to go to the Hill and argue for funding for an organization like the USGS. And people would be like, well, why do we need the USGS? And I was like, well, there's not a lot of money out there from granting agencies to go just make a really good map of an area that maybe hasn't had a map made since the 1800s. And so like, you have to fund it through an organization that's willing to do it and has the people trained to do it. Otherwise, like, we literally don't have a map of this country that we live in. And so I often found that arguments like that were relatively convincing. And I think you could make an argument like that for taxonomy work too. I'm not hearing anyone doing it.
Yeah. I mean, so like building on your map thing, my sister-in-law is trying to build a house and they've just dug their third well trying to find water. And it seems like the map of our area is not complete enough and they can't even figure out where the water is, which is kind of mind blowing. And so that's a situation that, came up in our lives in the last week or two, where a better map would have been helpful. So it's interesting to know that geology is having similar comparable problems.
But at least with geology, at least here in the United States, we have an organization like the United States Geological Survey, and most states also have their own state-run geological survey. So like we've kind of dealt with that problem in a way. And I think part of that is because for a huge part of our nation's history, mining was one of the biggest industries in the country. And so like having maps of where things are is really important for figuring out where to go mine for minerals. And there's a lot of debate to be had about our outdated mining laws and whether or not we need new mines in the US for critical minerals that we're currently getting from sources that are maybe not as ethical or humanitarian as we could. But that's a completely different discussion than what we're talking about. So I think, we kind of solved the map problem by just making sure there were agencies on the ground who could do the work. And we almost need like a USGS for taxonomy, I guess.
Well, it's interesting because my understanding is that the entomology in the United States is large, like professional entomology is largely founded on the need to control the American locust or the Rocky Mountain locust in the early part of last century and the century before. So the first like state entomologists were employed to do that in, I think, Illinois and maybe Iowa. But now so it was such a big problem, it was eating everyone's crops, and they've essentially succeeded in making it go extinct. And now we don't have big problems like that, or they're dealt with by private companies. So I agree that the government stepping in to provide funding as a public service would be great. And I think that was where entomology or professional entomology got its start here, but it's kind of fallen away.
And it's interesting how that sort of ties in, Andrew, to what you were saying about, Darwin and the landed gentry of Britain back when sort of doing natural history, doing science was like a hobby for rich people. Like the fact that, Darwin, never had a job. Like he never was a professor. He never needed to work. He just had money and land. And I've actually been to his estate in Britain, and like all the hiking or the walking trails that he used to walk on are still there. And you can just walk around the same trails that Darwin walked. And it's kind of amazing, but it also makes you realize like, oh, this guy was able to produce really good, strong, rigorous science and science writing because he just had time. Like he was just able to walk around and check stuff out. And now that science is a career, it actually presents challenges. Obviously, it opens it up to more people than just rich white dudes, but it does present all these other challenges of like, how do you get the funding if it's not just your family inheritance and you like beetles?
Yeah, totally. Finding that time to sit and think is nearly impossible these days, it seems. So all right, so we've established that the amazing data set on hymenopterans is not what you founded this argument on. So what did you found the argument that there are more wasps than beetles on?
Right. So I should say we're definitely not the first group to think that this might be true. And the reason that no one had published a paper like this or exactly like this before is because there isn't a lot of data out there. We don't have good information about how many species of wasp are even in many local systems. So what we decided to do was make an argument that relied on the ratio of parasitic wasps to their hosts in a number of different systems where there was some data. And this is based on a kind of a similar argument that a beetle person, a coleopterist named Terry Irwin, used many years ago in the rainforest to try to estimate the number of insects in rainforest systems. So what he did was he used an insecticidal fogger to put insecticide into the canopy of specific species of rainforest trees. And so when he did this, all the insects fall out of the tree, right? And they land in a big sheet. If you've ever seen the movie Arachnophobia, they do that at the beginning of the movie. That's how they introduce deadly spiders into communities. So all these things fall down, and then he looked at all the beetles that he caught from this one species of tree, and he figured out how many of them were specialists just on that tree species. And then he multiplied that number of specialists by the number of different tree species that are in the rainforest and came up with an estimate for the number of specialist beetles that there probably are in the world's rainforests. So I really think that's a super clever idea, a way to estimate what diversity might be out there without actually going and counting every single species. So we decided to use the same kind of approach for parasitic wasps, essentially figuring out an average number of specialist wasps that attack a particular genus of host insects, and then using those estimates to figure out how many total species of parasitic wasps there might be. There's still a problem because we don't have a lot of systems where we know those ratios, but we were able to find one genus of beetle, one genus of fly, one genus of moth, and a species of basal hymenoptera, so a sawfly. And we figured out how many specialist parasitic wasps attack each of those, the insects in each of those genera, and we're able to come up with a ratio that we can use to estimate the total number of parasitic wasps, or at least the relative total number of parasitic wasps compared to these other orders of insects.
So first, because you mentioned arachnophobia, very quick side note, a parasitologist recently identified a new species of nematode that kills tarantulas, and he named it after Jeff Daniels, who killed tarantulas in arachnophobia. And I thought that was particularly hilarious and wonderful.
That's great.
But so I find your argument super convincing. Maybe that's because I'm a wasp person now, and I totally buy into the fact that the idea that there's more wasps than beetles. But I bet this made lots of people really angry. So what kind of pushback did you get? Or was everybody like, oh, yes, that is a very sound, well-reasoned argument, and they just went along with it?
I mean, I'm on Twitter, so we got all sorts of things. The one, I would say that most people were excited, as generally people are, about new papers, especially papers that have kind of a controversial subject matter. Definitely not everyone agrees. The sort of pushback came mostly from coleopterists, which is understandable. And their argument tended to be more something along the lines of, well, this is all well and good, but you really need to go out and name all the species before there are more species of wasps than there are beetles. So essentially,
it's like the meme where somebody says, like, somebody criticizes some aspect of like living in late stage capitalism, and the response is like, but you participate in capitalism. It's like, well, yeah, but I can do about that right now, but I can still make this other point.
Yeah, that was my response at the time as well. Again, I'm not really a taxonomist or a trained entomologist. And as I've come to understand that world a little bit more, the argument does make a bit more sense to me now. There is a real importance and a real meaningfulness to describing species. And I do think that work needs to be done, and I do think it needs to be funded. But I don't think it, I don't think it really impacts our argument at all. Like, yes, we need to name these things, but it doesn't detract from the argument that there are probably more wasps out there than there are beetles.
If anything, your paper kind of could be used by someone trying to get funding to be like, look, we have every reason to believe there's a lot of work to be done here. Yeah. So this is why I need the funding to go catch and name all these different wasps.
Yeah, that's our hope as well. I'll mention one other type of feedback that we got that I found really interesting, which was people saying, oh, yeah, there probably are more wasps than beetles, but what about mites? And what about nematodes? And that is an interesting response, because there's kind of a similar problem with those two groups of animals, right? Where they've been really hard to study. There aren't a lot of taxonomists. There's not a huge amount of taxonomic resources. And what's also cool is there are species of mites and nematodes in a lot of insects. And so it may be that in the same way that parasitic wasps, like we use this sort of ratio of host to parasite for parasitic wasps and their host insects, it might be that there are a whole bunch of undiscovered mites and nematodes inside of insects or other hosts that sort of remain to be discovered. And I actually think that's a really fun argument, and it's a direction our lab has started to go, trying to figure out, okay, can we make these estimates of how diverse mites might be in insects or nematodes might be in insects?
There's another way you could push back on that. I don't know if you would even call it a criticism, but that sort of counterpoint. And this, again, is like getting into the taxonomic weeds in ways that probably aren't super helpful. But
yeah, I know where you're going with this. Go ahead. Yeah.
Neither mites nor nematodes are an order, right?
That's right.
You're looking at a much higher taxonomic level with either of those examples than you are when you just consider insect orders.
Right. One of the people who wrote that, I think it was about nematodes, he said, well, it's probably nematodes. And the science writer Ed Yong responded to him and said, he said you're comparing a phylum to an order, which was, it was nice having Ed Yong back us up there. That was cool.
It's like, have you considered the kingdom plants?
Exactly.
Okay. So can we, is it useful at all to drill into the numbers here a little bit? Like what was the sort of shift in the before and after estimates of Hymenoptera diversity that we're talking about based on your analysis?
Yeah, a lot of people have tried to ask me about the numbers before, but it's really a ratio-based argument. It's more about what ratio of parasitoids to host insects would result in there being more Hymenoptera than beetles.
Okay.
And so we do provide some estimates of numbers. Like if you use our ratios in various ways, you can come up with estimates for how many Hymenoptera there would be. And so one of our estimates is almost 500,000 species, and another one is more than 1 million species. But those are based on the number of described host insects, because again, we're just estimating ratios. So those are probably like minimum numbers. I bet I would guess there's between 1 and 2 million species out there if we're even close to the right ratios with our numbers.
So I've been really blown away by how many parasitoid species can infect just one host insect species. Can you dig into an example to sort of illustrate for people just how much diversity there is out there infecting even just, one example of a host species?
Yeah. Yep. Let me do one. Since you say that the podcast always goes to either poop or sex, I'll go to a poop example. There are these yeah. There are these beetles in the genus Neoclimasis, and I was collaborating with a guy named Dan Funk for a while on these beetles and looking at their parasitoid associates. And these beetles are cool because the female lays an egg, and then she makes this protective covering around the egg with her own frass, which is the entomologist term for poop. And then the egg hatches, and the larva starts eating leaves. And as it grows, it starts adding this shell, growing this shell of poop around its body, kind of like a little poop turtle. And then it pupates in a casing of its own feces. And so Dan had been collecting these beetles for something like 15 years, and every so often he would a parasitic wasp would come out, and he sent them all to me to figure out how many wasps were in the system. And what we found is that attacking just this one species of beetle across its egg and larval and pupal stages were more than 20 different species of parasitic wasps. So those are different wasp species all attacking this one beetle species.
The idea of building a poop-based suit of armor, I just hope Jon Favreau is taking notes for the Iron Man reboot. Right?
Yeah, well, it's apparently not very effective because, a lot of things can still kill you inside your poop suit.
Well, and so then the tough thing with that number is, so you've got one beetle with 20 wasps. So in that case, the wasps are outnumbering the beetle by 20. But then do we know, out of those 20, how many of those 20 only infect that beetle, or is that a system that needs a little bit more study? Yeah,
that's exactly the problem. That's why people hadn't published a paper like our one before. Those 20 whatever parasitic wasps could be attacking every other beetle in the region. They could be all complete generalists, and you don't know that until you've really dug into the natural history, biology, molecular biology even of each of those parasitic wasp species. So we don't have that data for most systems, and we were lucky, I think, to be able to dig it up for just the 4 systems we were able to. So it's a big problem.
A thought I had, and I feel like this is a thought I'm always bring to bear when people have presented a really cool argument, and I throw out this what if. I think it actually supports your argument, if anything. And your paper is really just thinking about extant species, right? We also, these groups of animals, beetles and wasps have been around since the Jurassic, at least.
Mm-hmm.
So, would you imagine I guess in your mind, do you think this is sort of always like, have wasps always been parasitic since they first evolved, or is this a more modern ecosystem configuration that has sort of speaks more to the moment than to deep time?
Well, Hymenoptera, like we know that Hymenoptera were not parasitic on other insects when they first evolved. I guess I don't know that for sure, actually, not having taken entomology, but the sawflies are at the base of the Hymenopteran tree, and many of those are parasitic on plants. So they have they're called sawflies because they have a saw-like ovipositor, and they cut little holes into trees or the needles of conifers or different places and lay their eggs in there. My guess is, and probably we know this already, the parasitic wasps only start taking off when there are a whole lot of insect hosts available for them to start attacking. And that's almost certainly the reason for their great diversity.
That makes sense to me. I think that scans.
Yeah, I mean, the similar thing's true for a lot of the plant-eating insects, and beetles are included in this. You start to see their numbers increase when you start to see angiosperms increase in diversity.
Yeah, flowering plants. Yeah, that's definitely a trend. There used to be, excuse me, there used to be a thought in paleontology that angiosperms diversified along with herbivorous dinosaurs like the ceratopsians, but I believe that argument or line of reasoning has been almost entirely abandoned for the plant-insect coevolutionary relationship.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Why couldn't it also hold for the dinosaurs?
I'm not a dinosaur guy. I don't know. I just know that I was taught one thing in undergrad, and then by the time I was finishing grad school, that wasn't the thing anymore, and I didn't look into it further.
Got it. That's frustrating. But you know what I do when I'm frustrated? I drink. Should we talk about our drink?
Well, I was also going to point out that one of your co-authors on this paper, Andrew's last name is Beer.
Yeah. Yes. Yep. Mark Beer. He was an undergraduate in my lab. He's a great, really smart student. And yes, his last name is Beer.
So in celebration of Mark and all your co-authors on this paper and Kelly's frustration with my lack of ceratopsian diversity knowledge. Sorry, Kelly. Oh, I did have one last question for you about this paper first, Andrew.
Yeah, go ahead.
I know you're not an entomologist, but where is entomology on the species concept situation? Because, I mostly think about species concept in terms of vertebrates. I don't really think about invertebrates and let alone get into the prokaryotic mess of it all. But
yeah, that's a good question. I think most people generally observe something like the biological species concept. So to be different species, they can't reproduce or don't reproduce, right?
Right.
I have seen, you do see some papers that use like clustering concepts or phylogenetic concepts as well. So it kind of jumps around. But I think generally people use the biological species concept or some variation on it.
And I've heard with insects, a lot of times the differentiation that prevents crossbreeding between species is the genitalia shape. Like I've heard it's almost like a lock and key thing where like a lot of insect species that look very similar, if their genitalia don't fit together, they can't breed.
Yeah, I think that's been used in some systems. I would say a lot of the systems I work on, one of the big barriers is often ecological. So if you are attacking a plant species, you're laying your eggs in that plant and you're spending all of your time on that plant, and another closely related species is using a different plant, you're never going to meet. And so that's effectively a reproductive barrier, and it's one that has to do with habitat choice and sort of behavior. So I think that's pretty common in insects, at least as an initial barrier to reproduction.
And then the thing I always have to explain to people whenever a new paper comes out that says, this dinosaur was actually a juvenile of this dinosaur, or T-Rex is 3 species, which we're not going to get into right now, is once you're in the paleontological realm, you're almost completely beholden to the morphological species concept because you just don't have any other data unless you can pull DNA, which are starting to get better at with, the stuff coming out of the Siberian tundra, but dinosaurs are still a little too old for that level of analysis. So.
Well, do you think they'll always be too old? Will we actually be able to extract their ancient DNA? Isn't there some limit at some point?
Yes, I believe there is. There are people who have argued that they've been able to find soft tissue preservation in dinosaurs, which is, in my mind, still a little far-fetched. You know, we have like impressions of skin and things like that. But yeah, I think chemically DNA just can't last as long as we would need it to. I think the idea that we can sort of reverse engineer between the gap that exists between modern avian birds and archosaurs, you know, other more basal archosaurs like crocodilians, is probably where we're going to start figuring out what the DNA strand of a dinosaur might look like, but that's really kind of reversing a jigsaw puzzle rather than extracting anything from an actual sample, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's cool.
Got it. Yeah.
So with all that in mind, let's examine the DNA strand of hops, barley, and most importantly, I think, yeast in our next segment. What are we drinking? It would not be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't also talk about what we are drinking. I'm going to go first and I'm going to go last. How about that? I'm going to bracket myself because it's early enough in the day that I'm still having some coffee, and I have a very nice coffee that I wanted to talk about. I have a bag of, I cut the label off of my bags of coffee and then store it in a little canister where I keep the coffee. So I can't actually remember the roaster for this. It's something with a B and a W. But this is a Jorge Raul Rivera Pacamara honey number 96 from Chalatenango, El Salvador, with notes of candied grapefruit, wine grape, and vibrant. Honey process, light medium roast. Pulled a shot in my espresso machine and made an Americano with it, and it is a delight. It smells so good that even Julie from the other room was like, "What are you making?" Because that smells amazing.
Wow. Do you feel like you can taste all the things that were mentioned on the bag?
You know, I have to feel like it's definitely, you lead the witness with those labels a little bit. I think if you just asked me to describe it without giving me those terms, I probably wouldn't come up with the same terms, but I might come up with something like citrus, nutty, you know, I think, but who knows? I feel like when you actually test people on their taste profiles, like they're, I think I've read studies that like people have a hard time telling the difference between red and white wine if they're blinded properly. And I'm just like, that's insane to me, but that's what happens. What about you, Kelly? What are you enjoying this afternoon?
Well, I had wanted to go out and get a beer, but schedule didn't permit. And so I am celebrating spring with a White Salamander, which is a mix of rum, Irish cream, and a little bit of milk. But since I have a lactose intolerant child, it's lactate, which makes it a little bit less cool. But anyway, I'm feeling good about spring. I'm hoping to see some salamanders soon, and it's a nice way to ring in the warming weather in Virginia.
Now, I feel like you've upped your cocktail game recently with your new endeavor, which we haven't had a chance to talk about yet. Do you want to tell people a little bit about your new outreach effort?
Well, so we just wrapped up season 1. So my buddy Scott Solomon and I did this event called D.O.R.K.S. It's discussing our knowledge and research socially, and which was an acronym that Zach came up with, and I was pretty proud of him. And so I know, and he's a clever guy sometimes. It's 2 talks each week. Anybody who wants to volunteer to talk about the dorky things that they love, and they give a 10 to 15 minute presentation, and then Scott and I ask them questions for a while, and then we have a big discussion with both speakers and both Scott and I. And it was a lot of fun. I'm doing my sort of non-traditional academic sidetrack thing, so I miss running into people in the hallway and hearing about the dorky things that they love that are totally different than what I do. And so this was my way of filling that gap in my heart. And it was fun, and it's on YouTube now. And if you want information about where you can find the YouTube channel or information about when we're going to start it back up again, on Twitter, we're at D.O.R.K.S Chat. And yeah, it was fun, but we're taking a break now.
I will link to that in the show notes for this episode as well, scienceorb.com, if you want to find those links, so you don't have to write anything down or remember it in the moment. The reason I mentioned it is because in the invitations, you always also give people cocktail recipes.
That's right. And so that was Scott. Scott did all the legwork on that. So for each set of talks is on a similar theme. We match the speakers up. And then Scott goes out and searches for a cocktail and a mocktail that match the theme. And so a mocktail is, like a mixed drink without any alcohol in it, so that, kids or people who don't drink can be involved as well. And so actually this White Salamander was one of the drinks that he found for our, I think, freshwater critters episode. And so I am just stealing from Scott Solomon's prior hard work. So thanks, Scott.
Now, is the lactate milk, is that still beef juice but without the lactose in it, or like, because there's a lot of milk alternatives out there these days?
So I think that this is milk. It took me a second to mentally translate beef juice.
I know, isn't that gross?
Milk, but it says pretty gross. Yeah, thanks. And so this is milk with lactase in it already to break the lactose into its simpler sugars. And so it actually weirdly tastes sweeter than usual milk.
Ah, so it's enzymatically treated milk.
Yeah. Okay, and this doesn't bother my daughter's stomach, so we go with that.
That's interesting. I did not know that. Having an infant, it's very, I think I came up with a term I've never seen in the scientific literature before. He's starting to transition to some soft and mushy foods, but the teeth haven't showed up yet. So I refer to him as an obligate lactivore.
Cute.
I thought it was a good term. It works. Sometimes I mix up the Spanish and the Latin in my head and I call him a lechivore, which I think is also pretty cute.
I think that might even be cuter.
You like lechivore better?
Mm-hmm.
I will keep that in mind, but I would say he's no longer, now he's more of a facultative lechivore as he starts to transition to some more adult foods. Andrew, what about you? Are you having a glass of milk or something else?
I'm not having a glass of milk. I did have a nice, delicious gas station coffee earlier today, which sounds like it did not compare to what you're having. But my son was born 14 years ago next week. And when he was born, I put a bunch of beer up to age so that I could have it over the years on his birthday or near his birthday. So I grabbed one of those for today. And it is a 2008 Bigfoot Barleywine by Sierra Nevada. And yeah, it's very good. It's after many years of barley wine, will lose some of its hoppiness and will start to mellow out a little bit. And it's aged really well. It's really nice.
I had some bourbon-barrel aged Torpedo, Sierra Nevada's double IPA.
Yeah.
And it was, the description, it did not prompt me with any tasting notes like my coffee did. But the description I gave for it was IPA candy. It was just like, it was so like kind of subtly sweet. And you're totally right. I think the hop flavor is usually the flavor that fades first and the most. So you end up getting a lot of the richer, maltier notes.
And I feel like we're lucky that you decided to share that with us today. Such an old beer that's been sitting on your table. I think we should feel honored.
Well, so it's funny. I also like brewed my own beer back then before I had kids because I had time. And one of the beer I brewed for his birth was a barley wine also. And that one is subjectively terrible now. So they don't all age well. And it could be that this beer would have been terrible. And so I was taking a bit of a risk. It might've been bad.
Yeah, I do appreciate now that a lot of breweries will be very clear in like at least a lot of the craft breweries will be clear in sort of like this will sell her well or drink this as fresh as you can. And I like that they're making that distinction for me so I don't have to try. I've gambled on a few things. I aged a Eric's Ale, which is like a peach sour from the Lips of Faith series from New Belgium for like 10 years or so. And it actually lost a lot of its sourness and peachiness, but still was drinkable. And it was right on the cusp. It was like a 7%. And generally speaking, you want to, anything you want to age or cellar for a while, you want it 7% or up.
Yeah, they can be like tasting, drinking soy sauce if they get too old and they start to oxidize too much.
Vinegary.
Yeah, really not good.
Yeah. Well, I had a hint that you were going to be having something fairly epic from our correspondence before recording. So I wanted to match that and celebrate with you.
Great.
So I am popping open a Hawk Knob elderberry infused dry hard cider that spent 8 months in a bourbon barrel.
Wow.
And this is from a Hawk Knob cidery in Lewisburg, West Virginia. So they are an Appalachian cider company, which is appropriate because we were talking about apples and wasps and stuff like that before. So this is a Appalachian product. Apples are a big industry in West Virginia still to this day. I actually visited an apple farm not long ago, and they had something like 120 plus varieties of apples available. So Johnny Appleseed really got to work well in the Mountain State. And this is very nice. It is
we've been researching apple trees with the goal of planting some apple trees because my son is obsessed with apples, and we went to sample some of the varieties the other day, and I had in my mind that like artificial selection has probably given us the best apples that there are. We will find those at our grocery store. And that's totally wrong. Like most of the berries that I find in the woods and I sample, I think to myself, artificial selection really got us far on the berry front. But in terms of apples, these other varieties that are not in the grocery stores are like way more flavorful and awesome. And I think everybody should go visit their local apple orchard if they can.
I think in terms of modern American food production, the artificial selection pushes them more towards storage and transportability than flavor.
For apples, that definitely seems to be the case.
You don't think the Red Delicious is the pinnacle of apple today?
I don't hate on the Red Delicious the way a lot of people do. And I'm a guy who'll go to town on a Golden Delicious, so I'm not about that. But orangepippin.com, Kelly, is a really great website for looking up all the different varieties of apples that are available in the heritage sort of space. So there's some really cool ones out there.
I'll check it out.
I'll try to remember to put a link to that in the show notes. But yeah, this hawk knob is really good because of the elderberry. It's not like coming super strong with the apple. It actually more has like the sort of dry, sour tartness you might get from a hard cider is more of a berry kind of tartness. It's nice. It's very good. Very drinkable given its ABV. It's clocking in at 10%.
Yeah, I since we're recording this, it's only 1 o'clock here, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm at work and I haven't had any lunch yet. I definitely am registering the alcohol.
Well, then we better get to this next paper before we all need a nap. So let's head on over to our second segment, talking about the generalist that should not be a generalist, coming up in just a moment. So for our second segment this episode, we wanted to talk about another paper that you published. I should have mentioned that previous paper we were talking about is open access, so the link to that in the show notes of the website will be available to anyone. I didn't notice if this one was also open access, but the title of this paper, which I'll have you translate in just a moment, Andrew, this was published in Insect Systematics and Diversity, year of our Lord 2022, so hot off the press. Ormyrus labotus, Hymenoptera ormyridae, another generalist that should not be a generalist, is not a generalist. So I think Kelly mentioned before we started recording that you have a flair for clever titles, and I would say this one definitely fits the bill, but can you break down a little bit what this title is trying to tell the reader?
Right. So what we're trying to get across here is that there's a species of wasp that's named Ormyrus labotus, and it has been described in the past as a generalist wasp, meaning that it attacks lots of different hosts. And we suspected that it shouldn't be a generalist for reasons that we can discuss. And we found, in fact, that it was not a generalist.
So when you talk about this term generalist versus specialist, we talked about it a little bit in the previous segment, but can we kind of drill into precisely what that term means when we're referring to, wasps and parasitoids in general?
Yeah. A precise definition, sure. It is it's a little bit hard to give a precise definition because I think different people define specialists and generalists in different ways. you could say that a specialist is a species that only has one host, that only lays its eggs into, one other species. But you could also define it as something that has a more limited range of hosts and is focusing on just one or a few dimensions of a sort of a host environment. Either way you break it up, it's generally assumed to be a fewer number of hosts than a generalist would attack. So a generalist is something that's going to have several different hosts and is going to be sort of less limited, less restricted in the number and types of hosts that it can attack.
That's cool. I actually deal with something a little similar in my research with sloth ecology, in that if you look at the number of tree species, that the species level three-fingered sloth or three-toed sloth, but it's the difference in digits is actually on the manus, so I try to say fingered instead of toed these days. The three-fingered sloth will eat 24 or so different tree species leaves, maybe up to 30. But the individual sloth has a strong preference for only 5 or 6 of those 30 species. So, it appears more generalist at the species level than the individual actually demonstrates. One of the reasons it's so difficult to keep in captivity is because if you don't know that sloth's specific dietary preferences, it just won't eat and it will die.
So it's actually a preference and not like the sloth is so slow moving it only gets to the 5 trees that are close to where it was born, that it's actually like a preference for certain species?
It seems to be a learned behavior from their mothers. They seem to learn what species mom eats from while they're still hanging out with her, literally hanging. And when they move out on their own, I believe most of the time their range will contain, sloths don't have a huge range, but they do have a range like many mammals. And their range, I think, will usually contain a variety of those potential trees that they could eat from. And there's only 1 or 2 species that like consistently overlap across all sloths, and the rest of them all kind of, do their own thing that they learn from mom. We think. Sloths are weird.
Interesting.
But getting back to wasps, why is it important that we know whether a species of parasite is a generalist or a specialist, Andrew?
Yeah, I can give you a lot of different reasons for that. The reason I care is because I'm interested in sort of defining diversity, discovering diversity. And so finding cryptic species is just in my wheelhouse. It's something I'm independently interested in. On a more practical level, you could have maybe a conservation reason for wanting to know that there are multiple different specialist species hiding within this thing that we're calling a generalist. If it's actually multiple different species and each one of them is dependent on just a small number of hosts, then if any of those small number of those hosts go extinct, you lose the parasite as well. And so it's important to know how specialized these things are so that we can sort of preserve that diversity. The other argument is maybe more applied. These are parasites that attack insects that eat plants. And so if we are interested in controlling that plant-eating insect, like a pest insect, we should really, and we want to use biological control, so use the parasites to kill the plant-eating insect. We really should know who the correct parasite is. So we should be able to sort of collect and breed the parasite that actually is specialized on the plant-eating insect we're trying to control. And so in terms of like a agricultural pest issue, I think it's important there as well.
In the pre-molecular era, how much were cryptic species sort of like on our mind? So now they're easier to find because you can go to the molecular data. Before it would have been harder. Was cryptic species something that people were like, oh, we think this is a big thing, if only we could separate them out? Or is this something that has become obvious only now that we have the molecular tools to sort of tell them apart?
Yeah, I think it's something that really has only become, I won't say possible, but approachable with molecular tools. It's just a lot of species definitions traditionally have been relied on morphology, sometimes ecology as well, but usually morphology. And so if the morphological characters that differentiate species are not obvious, or the taxonomist working with those animals doesn't key into them, then they're going to combine those species together. And yeah, it just hasn't been feasible or economical until recently to interrogate them with molecular markers.
And so what did you actually do to make the determination here that this generalist species is not actually a generalist? Like, what was the actual method you applied?
Yeah. So I think we have to maybe explain the system we're working in first, and maybe Kelly can help me a little bit here. So these are parasites that attack a group of animals called gall wasps, or oak gall wasps in this case. And so the oak gall wasps are herbivorous wasps that lay their eggs into various tissues of oak trees. And after they do that, it induces the oak tree to form what's known as a gall. And that's like a structured growth of oak tree tissue that can be quite different depending on which oak gall wasp laid the eggs. It's basically a swelling, and inside will be one or more capsules inside which the baby oak gall wasp will develop. And so it provides food and a putative level of protection to the developing oak gall wasp.
And if people want to learn more about that system, we did have Scott Egan on for an episode 292, where he and Kelly talked about some work that they'd done on the oak gall wasp system.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Pause your listening and go listen to that, and then come back.
This is my Stan Lee style editor's note. Hey there, Marvel mavens.
And Andrew was a co-author on all of those papers.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, only because I was called in to do some of the parasitoid wasp stuff. But yeah, so there's all these galls,
which was critical.
Which thank you. I want to compliment you and Scott in a number of different ways here, but there's too many. So there's something like 700 different species of oak gall wasp in North America, and each one of them induces one or sometimes two different galls, and each of those galls is different in some way in its morphology. Some of them have like spines or hairs, and some have like these weird fibers inside that suspend the gall chamber in the middle, so there's like empty spaces inside. And so that makes it pretty challenging if you're a parasite to attack many different galls, because each gall has a different set of defenses. So if you get really good at attacking one gall, it might impact your ability in a negative way to attack one of the other galls. That's why it didn't make any sense to us that Ormyrus lobotus, which had been described as attacking 65 different gall wasps, it didn't make any sense to us that it could be that generalist. Like, being good at attacking some of these galls should obviously make it hard to attack other galls or other gall wasps. And so you asked what we did. We collected Ormyrus lobotus from as many different galls as we could in North America. So we went and collected galls from oak trees all around the country, reared out all the insects, got all the Ormyrus wasps, and then sequenced a small fragment of their mitochondrial DNA, looked for differences in the mitochondrial DNA, and then tried to see if those differences matched up with different host associations and a number of other different ecological differences as well. And what we found is evidence for somewhere between 16 and 18, maybe a few more actually, species that were all being called Ormyrus lobotus, but in fact were, again, different species attacking a very small number of hosts on a very small number of trees.
Mitochondrial DNA in insects, is it also through the maternal line like it is in humans and vertebrates, as far as I know?
Yep,
Okay.
In almost all cases, yep.
Okay, cool. Just never thought about that before.
So are they all in the same genus and closely related, and they just look sort of similar? How distantly related do you think they are?
Well, all we've done is sequence one gene, so you don't I have trouble with talking about evolutionary relationships from a single gene tree, but based on that, now I'm going to do it. Based on that gene tree, it looks like something like 12 to 14 of them are in the same clade, so all share a recent common ancestor. But then 2 or 3 of them are more distantly related Ormyrus species, and they just kind of look superficially like the other ones, and so they were grouped into the Ormyrus lobotus name.
Got it. So is this an interesting group because there's so much diversity? Like, these somewhat closely related insects are infecting lots of different host species. Is that pretty common for different genera of these parasitoid wasps, or is Ormyrus sort of special in some way?
I would say that it is pretty common, but I also would say that there isn't a lot of evidence either way yet, mainly because of this taxonomic problem that we talked about in the first part of our conversation. We've named a lot of things as being generalist species of parasitic wasp. And when we've gone in and interrogated using molecular and ecological tools, in many cases, we found a lot of extra cryptic species. I think that's going to end up being the rule rather than the exception, but it's kind of too early to say. We need to do more studies like this where we're collecting things and then sequencing one or more genes and then trying to relate that back to the ecology.
It sounds like, the paper we talked about in the first segment was a bit of a bombshell in the community and generated a lot of interesting discussion. What was the sort of reception like on this one? Are there people who are emotionally invested in whether or not different species are generalists versus specialists?
Well, I think most people just like the silly title, but there was we've gotten some interesting responses from people who are interested in the limits of parasitic wasp diversity, and a number of people who are saying, well, we think this is more common, and we need to, as I just said, we need to go out and do more of this work where we're collecting and looking for cryptic species. So I think one of the reasons why there's the word another in the title, so another generalist that should not be a generalist is not a generalist, is because there are a number of studies that have shown something like this before. And what we're trying to highlight is that it probably is really common. And so, a number of the responses have been people agreeing with us saying, yeah, this probably is really common and we need to look for it.
So I know that what we all study is awesome. And so I shouldn't be surprised that the press has been so excited about it. But I have sort of been surprised by how excited the press is about wasp-related stories. Like Caloritis Valhalla got a bunch of press, and that was super cool. But tons of species are described that don't get any press. And I can't tell. So to some extent, I think that you and Scott and me to a small extent, like, we're good at packaging, and that packaging helps move it forward. But it also seems like people are interested in wasps, and it's not just clever titles. And I guess, what do you think? Are you surprised by all the press that the wasp-related stuff has been getting lately, or does it just seem obvious that people should love wasps?
No, I'm really surprised. The New York Times wrote about this paper, which the main author on this, the senior author is Sophia Sheik, my master's student, now a PhD student at Chicago. She and I were both like completely amazed, because for us it was a paper where we were showing that there were more species than were expected in this system. But I think that there is something about the biology of these animals that I don't know, captures people's imagination or like activates their gag reflex or something that makes them really interested. These are things that eat the bodies of other insects, and there are hundreds of thousands of species of them, and I think people find that cool.
Well, I think it's interesting. Hymenoptera in particular has like almost, I think, the widest range of emotions associated with any group of insects that I can think of off the top of my head. Like, because honeybees and bumblebees, like, oh, you're fuzzy, you're cute, you make honey, you kind of like you look like a little blimp with these little wings, and versus like ants are ruining your picnic and wasps are attacking you and killing you. And
yeah,
I wonder if it's almost like the dichotomy in people's emotional reaction to these insects that affects how strong the response is when you publish these sorts of papers.
Well, when we published the one about how many wasps there were, like saying that wasps were the most common group of animals, I think a lot of people were thinking about stinging wasps and then being quite worried that there were so many of them that might sting them. And so that was part of it, that people don't want to get stung by wasps. But these, what I often have to say to people is that these wasps can't sting you. You won't even notice they're there. They're too small to see most of the time. These are tiny little animals.
And am I correct in thinking that the stinger in hymenopteran insects is thought to have evolved from an ovipositor, like the egg-laying organ?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So,
it is still an egg-laying organ in the parasitic wasps. They're delivering venom to paralyze, in most cases, their host, but they're also laying an egg.
With your background in philosophy, I feel like you need to maybe do a paper on like people, the philosophical view of hymenopteran and why people have like such strong emotional reactions to them.
I mostly studied like moral philosophy, so a lot of John Rawls stuff. So unless there's like a theory of justice for wasps, I'm pretty useless there.
That's interesting. So you didn't get into like the philosophy of science or anything, because we've had Massimo Pigliucci on the show a couple of times.
Oh yeah,
and he's written a lot of I think approachable philosophy of science for someone who, like myself, who has a background in science but not a background in philosophy.
Yeah.
I imagine the whole species concept thing, if you have a background in philosophy, might keep you up at night more than the average scientist. But it seems like there's a real philosophical quagmire in that literally the most specific name we give an animal has no actual definition.
Right. Yeah.
But we're pretty sure it's a thing, right? Like species are real, right? Are they?
Yeah. I don't know. I haven't involved myself in that conversation all that much. There are definitely different things that are different from one another.
I mean, with Kelly getting into the whole apple tree game, there's like a really crazy thing about apples is that they're not true to seed. So you plant, you take a Red Delicious seed and you plant it. The tree that grows from that might not be a Red Delicious producing tree, which to me is just like a wild breaking of the rules when it comes to inheritance and species concepts.
I think that was the argument in the Botany of Desire book about why it was clear that Johnny Appleseed was planting apple trees for the purpose of making alcohol and not for like apples to eat, is because they don't true breed.
Yeah. So you can, if you're just throwing seeds out, you're probably going to get a lot of apples that are decent for fermenting, but not great for making a pie.
Yeah.
One thing you mentioned earlier when we were in this segment, when we were talking about this paper of like why this work is important, that I wanted to kind of circle back to, is this idea that, it's important to know like sort of who's connected to who in an ecosystem. And something I've been thinking about a lot from a conservation angle lately is this. I think this came about at the start of the pandemic when all of our supply chains were falling apart, because when you optimize things for efficiency, the trade-off, because this is something I tell people when I'm trying to teach biology, is that like everything in evolutionary biology is a trade-off. Like you have to min-max. You can't be great. You cannot like there's not really an animal that's like an amazing digger that's also like a really fast runner, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. You just kind of have to choose to specialize in one thing or another. And what that creates is ecosystems that are actually quite robust to disturbance. And the reason I was thinking about that in terms of our supply chains is our supply chains are built to be really lean and efficient. It's sort of that idea that like, if you don't have any fat on you and you get sick, you actually get a lot sicker because you don't have anything in reserve. And that's sort of where I saw our supply chain falling apart. And nature is the opposite. Nature is really robust, which is why we're able to do such damage to the natural ecosystem, and it persists because it's a pretty tough thing that has a lot of built-in redundancy at the cost of not being very efficient. And so I was thinking about that when you were talking about why this system is important to study, because you're essentially figuring out like how much disruption the network can take before it falls apart, right? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought a lot about the argument you're making there, but it seems to me that at least the fact that there are multiple different species attacking each gall wasp or each host insect is sort of a built-in resiliency there, in terms of there being some parasitic control over the population size of those hosts. I don't see how it applies necessarily to the sort of the specialist versus generalist thing.
Okay, yeah, it was a bit of a stretch. It was just something where my mind went when you were explaining the importance of the research, which I agree with. I was just trying to think of it in a conservation angle.
I have another unfair question that's going to ask you to stretch knowledge and expand into the realm of speculation. So, okay. Ormyrus is beautiful. Like, I love looking at photos of this parasitoid. It's like
Yeah.
sort of iridescent. It has all of these pretty colors. Why? Why are these like so many of the parasitoids that come out that I see are these beautiful iridescent colors, and I haven't been able to find in the literature a good answer for why. Have I missed it? And if so, let me know what I missed. Or do you want to speculate on why they're so darn pretty?
Gosh, I have no idea. I agree with you that they're really pretty. Every species is pretty in a different way. They're shiny, or sometimes if you put the wings on the right background and shine light through them, they're really, as you said, iridescent. They have all these different colorful patterns in them, even though under regular light they look clear. But I have no idea. I don't have a good answer for that.
I mean, I believe iridescence requires some like energetic expenditure into the microstructures that are necessary to bounce light in that particular way. So it seems like they wouldn't be iridescent for no reason.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have not been able to find anything in the literature that explains why they would invest in those microstructures to create this iridescence. Although maybe it's just to please me, and that would be great.
Well, the Darwinian just so story would be to say sexual selection and leave it there.
Yep. If all else fails, just say it's to help get a mate.
Do males, are they sexually dimorphic? I mean, not that they'd need to be for it to be, it could be important for both sexes, but is there any evidence to support that?
There are some parasites have some sexually dimorphic characters. So there's one species that attacks, well, Scott Egan's favorite guller. There's a Bracema parasitoid where the females are these bright yellow wasps with these shiny green heads, and then the males are these tiny little small kind of greenish brown things. So they're really sexually dimorphic. In the Ormyrus and many of the other ones, they're not sexually dimorphic, but it could just be a recognition thing. Anything that looks like this is a potential mate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, females being the one that have the iridescence would be interesting in the animal kingdom. Sort of rare. I mean, there are some female cichlids that have coloration that the males cue in on, but usually it's the males who are the attractive mates in these cases. But anyway, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, usually the argument in animal coloration and mate attractingness is that, sperm is cheap and eggs are expensive, but I don't know if that still applies at the insect level when you're laying hundreds, if not thousands of eggs at a time.
Well, and female wasps can lay eggs that develop into males without even having mated. So mating is less important for the female.
Is that a haplodiploid thing?
Yeah, they're haplodiploid. So they can lay haploid unfertilized eggs that develop into male haploid wasps.
Right. So in hymenopterans, I don't know about other insects, but in hymenopterans, if an egg has half the amount of DNA, then it's a male. And if it has a full complement of DNA, then it's a female.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
Which is crazy. That is very cool. Well, to sort of wrap up everything we've been talking about, what are you working on next? What are you working on now that's got you excited? Where are you taking this research further, if you are indeed taking it further from this sort of idea or something completely different?
Yeah, we're going to be publishing some more in the oak gall wasp system. The main person who's been working on this in my lab is my PhD student, Anna Ward, and she has already put up as a preprint a phylogeny of a large number of North American oak gall wasps. And where we're hoping to go from there is to start studying the coevolutionary histories of the oak gall wasps with several of their different parasitic wasps. So how have the parasitoids evolved in concert with the oak gall wasps? And so we're really looking forward to that. We're just kind of finishing up those analyses now. I'm also, as I said before, starting to try to figure out how to study this question of mite and nematode diversity in insect hosts. So we're developing some methods to tackle that question.
Cool. And you mentioned earlier that you were on Twitter. Would you like to plug your Twitter handle or any other place on the internet that people can learn more about your work?
Sure. My Twitter handle is at Lord Forbington, which is...
Is there a story there?
Yeah. So in graduate school, we did what we also did today, which is we would get together and drink really fancy beers once a month. And we all gave ourselves nicknames, or we were given nicknames. And my wife and I were Lord and Lady Forbington. And so that kind of stuck.
There you go.
Yeah.
My wife played roller derby for a while, and her derby name, because you have to come up with a derby name, was Trilobiter, and her number was 350 MA, and which stands for 350 million years ago, which is when trilobites were around. And so all of her teammates used to always call me Masterbiter because I was still working on my PhD, and I had a master's, but I didn't have the PhD yet. And then when I defended, the call went out to the team that he is now Dr. Biter instead of.
That's better.
But I like Lord Forvington. Well, we will link to that, and you also have a lab webpage that is linked to on your Twitter bio. So folks who are interested in learning more, we haven't done this in a while, but sometimes if we have a professor on who has a very active and robust research program, are you looking for more students? If there are people who are getting ready to go to grad school, are you interested in hearing from folks?
We're always interested in hearing from potential students. I'd like to keep my lab group pretty small so I can spend more time with each of my students. But I do run a summer, it's called an REU program, Research Experiences for Undergraduates.
Yes.
So undergraduate students looking for something to do in the summer should get in touch, because we recruit students and we put them in faculty labs here, 10 students every summer. And the goal is to get them research experiences and then help them look at grad school after they graduate college. So,
that's awesome. And so this would ideally be a good program for folks in the Iowa City area?
No, in fact, we're actually interested in recruiting undergraduate students from all around the United States, including Puerto Rico and other territories. So, yeah, not
even
just
DC.
Not DC. No, definitely not DC.
Give us statehood already. I'm sick of this. Well, that's awesome. I'm glad we got a chance to touch on that. I know we have high school students and undergrads who listen, so I would say, take these sort of opportunities very seriously. I did not do an REU while I was an undergrad, and I think it would have been a really helpful experience for me entering grad school to have done that. So
yeah, it solidified my desire to go into research doing an REU as an undergrad. So
I didn't even know REUs existed until I got into grad school. I also think it would have been awesome, but it was not even on my radar.
Well, very cool. I think that's an awesome note to end on. So, Andrew, thank you very much for joining us. This was a really awesome conversation, and I'm glad we were able to chat.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, both of you. It was really fun, and I got to drink a great beer I've been waiting to drink for a while. So.
There you go. Well, with that, we're going to mosey on over to our final segment where we get some feedback from the fine folks at home, and that segment is called the PaleoPOW. To Andrew for giving us some of his time. We really appreciated getting to chat with him. I learned a lot, always fascinating I feel like, Kelly, whenever we talk to friends of yours, it's like looking at it's like looking at a crystal where it's like you're always showing me kind of like a different facet of the work you do by introducing me to a collaborator who you work with on similar projects, but does a slightly different thing than the last person we talked to in that same vein. Does that make sense?
It does. And I am so lucky with my collaborators because they're all like lovely people who are also very funny and work on things that are like just different enough that every time I talk to them, I learn something new, but like our interests are similar enough that it's sort of like, oh my gosh, what's the word that I'm looking for? Synergistic. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I'm glad that I got to get my friends together and that you got to chat with Andrew.
Parasitologist finds it hard to come up with word for working together. It feels like an Onion headline.
I love it. Yeah, that's perfect. And fun fact, Andrew and I have co-authored something like 4 or 5 papers now, and in between when we recorded the initial interview and today when we're recording the PaleoPOW, I actually got to meet him in real life. And he's absolutely charming and hilarious in real life too. So it's good when consistency happens.
That's wonderful. Well, speaking of synergy, I think you mentioned the PaleoPOW, and we have a synergistic relationship with our PaleoPOWs and patrons as well. The PaleoPOSSE, to remember that term that we used to use quite often. So I think with that in mind, let's walk on over to the PaleoPOW corner where we record that segment of the show, and we'll see you all over there after we've taken a quick jaunt and a stroll, accompanied by some music, which will be happening now. All right. The PaleoPOWs is a segment of the show where we invite and delight in feedback from you, the listener, and listeners like you. So, Kelly, I believe you have an email for us.
I do. Okay, so the subject is hyperparasitoids on Finnish islands, which is just like a great subject for an email. The message is, hi, Ryan, or maybe Kelly, or maybe someone else. This is Brett. Pronouns they, them, or he, him. I've been a listener since, I don't know, maybe 2014 or 2015. I saw an article that you all might enjoy reading. It covers a beautiful species of butterfly that was accidentally introduced to a certain island in Finland in the 90s, and a parasitoid wasp that parasitizes and kills the butterfly larvae, and a tiny hyperparasitoid wasp that parasitizes and kills the bigger wasp, which is somehow made easier by the presence of a bacterium in some females of the bigger wasps. What a fascinating system! This article also discusses the island-specific ecological concerns and how that intersects with climate change. Spoiler, it ain't helping. I'm an engineer, not a biologist, so I didn't get very far when I tried to read the underlying science paper. So I guess the questions I have are, 1, does the layperson's article fairly characterize the actual science, or are there important take-home ideas that it missed? And 2, just how common are hyperparasitoidal systems anyway? Do we know? And then he links to the 2 articles he's talking about and then says, I'm drinking a Therapist Imperial IPA by Dust Bowl Brewery from their tap room in Monterey, California. I have to say, it's pretty good. And by good, of course, I mean bitter, strong, and no freaking haze. Then he links to the beer and says, P.S. I'm an alum of UCSC and am at this very moment in the middle of a move back to Santa Cruz. I'm hoping that it will be as nice of a place to live in my 30s as it was in my 20s. Cheers, Brett. Brett, thank you for this awesome email.
In terms of living in Santa Cruz in my 30s versus when I lived there in my 20s, I feel like when I go back to San Francisco, my level of burrito consumption is so intense and so all-consuming that I think if I lived there all the time, maybe I'd be less hog wild about it if I actually lived there full time. But I think I would have I'd have to join a gym or have some other really strong exercise regimen to keep my burrito consumption at the levels of my 20s without some serious health consequences.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And then are you an IPA person?
Yeah, so I think Brett has listened to enough of the show that they are picking up on my casual disdain for the East Coast hazy style IPA, which has become, I would say, the dominant IPA style in the area where I live, as opposed to the filtered, crystal clear West Coast IPA. And I also kind of contend that I think the hazy IPA is a symptom of their easier to and less work to make than a West Coast style IPA. So I think that's part of the reason they've taken off in popularity. So I've learned to live with the defeat that this style has become the prevalent style, and so I do drink a lot of hazy IPAs, but I do still prefer a crisp, clean West Coast IPA when I can get my hands on one. That is for sure.
Got it. So we're kind of working our way backwards through this email. So I guess now that we've talked about burritos and beer, it's time to talk about parasitoids. Nice. Yeah, we're finally getting to the good stuff. So first of all, Brett wanted to know if the layperson's article fairly characterizes the actual science. And I've got to be honest, I read the layperson's article. I kind of scanned the science article. I am working on finishing my second book with Zach, and so my life is ridiculous. And as far as I could tell, it did look like the layperson's article did a good job of characterizing the actual science. And it was fascinating to read. I actually didn't know about this system, so thanks a boatload to Brett for sending it our way. And then he wanted to know how common are parasitoidal systems, and that are hyperparasitoidal systems. And that is an awesome question. So when we had Andrew on the show earlier, we talked a little bit about Eudericet, which we kind of think of as a hyperparasite, because the gall wasp parasitizes the tree, and then the parasitoid infects the gall wasp. And so that's like 2 levels of parasitism. Hyperparasitoids are fairly common. This doesn't get studied too much. But for example, I just read this awesome paper by my friend Shahinez, whose last name I'm going to forget how to pronounce, but I'll send a link to Ryan. And she found this, so she was looking at those isopods that you find in fish that hold on to the fish's tongue and replace the tongue. And that is a parasite. and it had living on it a monoginian. And so these are like, they're usually sort of clear, and like one side of their head is sort of sticky and has hooks so that they can hold on. And then their other side, they can sort of like crawl along with inchworms. So the other side, like inchworms. So the other side can also be sort of like a sticky sucker sort of thing. Anyway, what she found was that the monoginian is a hyperparasite of the isopod, but it's actually sucking blood from the fish. So it's hanging onto the isopod and then sucking blood from the fish. But we've got like multiple layers of parasites here. Ryan, do you know any hyperparasitoid examples?
So a hyperparasitoid is just when you have a parasite on a parasite that's on a host?
So I guess with hyperparasitoid, so I sort of went with a more general explanation of hyperparasite. So it's when you've got a host and then there's a parasite of the parasite. I guess parasitoid specifically implies that you have multiple layers of parasites that kill the host that they're infecting. So I sort of made my life easier by generalizing away from that. I have one more example I'm ready to give if you'd like me to jump into it.
I'm trying to think of, obviously don't know as many examples of parasitism in general. Well, okay. Would this work? There's I don't know if this works. All right, I'll pitch it and I'll see what you say. Strangler figs, trees, and wasps. So strangler figs are a type of fig tree that grows in the tropics where the fig seeds land on another tree and then they germinate and grow from there. And so the fig tree uses the host tree as structural support while it's young because it basically gets a jump start to reaching the canopy by growing on the branches of another tree. And it eventually engulfs the host tree and the host tree dies. And so you have these strangler figs that are like hundreds of years old that are hollow on the inside because the host tree has long since died and like fully rotted away. And then there's a wasp system that uses the fig. They pollinate the fig flowers, and then they oviposit into the flowers while they oviposit in the flowers, and in doing so they help the fig tree pollinate around the forest. But then the pollinated flower forms a fruit, and the fig fruit grows around the wasp eggs, and so the wasp eggs hatch inside the fig fruit, and then that's their food source as they mature and develop, and then pupate into adult wasps and dig their way out of the fig fruit and fly away.
So that is all awesome, and I didn't know about the figs that kill the host tree. That is epic, but I think this example is maybe a better example of how complicated nature is. And because she doesn't like nicely fit into categories. And so, if the wasp is pollinating, then that's helpful. If it kills the flowers, then maybe that's not so good. And so it might depend on a variety of things. I feel like that system's a little bit more hazy, but I didn't know that fig trees could kill host plants, which is awesome.
Are you accusing me of being like the hazy IPA of parasitoid examples when you're like the crystal clear West Coast style?
You're the IPA of science sort of co-hosts.
I'm bitter. I try to be clean, but sometimes I'm hazy.
Okay, so
I'm hopped up.
This is the metaphor that keeps on giving. But what I was thinking is that there is an aphid. So these are like little insects that you find on plants, and they can kill the plants. They can be a real pain in the rear end if they're in your garden. And they get infected by a parasitoid that can kill them. But the aphids can be infected by a bacteria. And some scientists found out that when the aphids were infected by a certain strain of bacteria, that would kill the parasitoids. And so the parasitoids were less able to kill the aphids. But then they looked at the bacteria more closely, and they're like, some of the strains of bacteria that like we think should be killing the parasitoids don't. And why is that? And it turned out that some of the strains of bacteria were also infected by a bacteriophage, which is a virus of bacteria. And so it was actually the virus of bacteria that was infecting the aphid that was protecting the aphid from the parasitoids. And we've sort of gotten away from hyperparasitoidism and more to like a complicated example, but it sort of ties in the like parasitoids, insects, and bacterium stuff that you see happening in Finland. And I guess the point is the closer you look, the more complicated things get.
Right. I was just looking up the ficus. Ficus is the genus of fig trees. I was just looking up the system to make sure that I had described it appropriately. And it does look like the interaction between figs and fig wasps. So these like wasps are specifically named fig wasps for their association with fig trees. And I guess it isn't always a pollinating wasp that actually deposits its larva in the fig. So there might not actually be a pollinator relationship with the oviposition or ovipositing. And they do also get galls, kleptoparasites, pollinating, non-pollinating wasps. And then the pollinating wasps actually apparently introduce a plant parasitic nematode to the fig tree. So the pollinated wasps are introducing a parasite to the parasitic fig tree. Oh my gosh.
You know, I think there's a good chance that we have directly answered neither of Brett's questions, but I think we've been interesting anyway with giving fun nature facts.
I think one of the reasons I was thinking of even though the wasps are pollinating, I guess some of the wasps are pollinating the flowers that lead to the fruit development, the fact that the larvae inside the fruit then eat the fruit means that the fruit that contains the seeds is not then getting eaten by a dispersing animal such as a bird. So it is probably preventing some of the reproductive success of the fig tree by having the larva consume the fruit instead of the disperser animal that the fruit is there.
I guess it depends on how much of the fruit the larva is eating. Like if it only eats a little, enough so that it survives and can go on to pollinate, you know, the next fig tree, then maybe that's not such a big deal. But if it is deterring birds and dispersers from eating it, then yes, it's a big deal. I feel like so many of these things are on a gradient where it depends on like how much is happening, whether it's good or bad, which can depend on a lot of other environmental conditions. And these relationships can shift.
Right. And apparently these fig trees, the strangler figs, had reported the presence of extrafloral nectaries, which is something that trees in the tropics especially use to feed ants who have arboreal hives on the tree, and the ants will then defend the tree. So you've got like both, you know, a insect mutualism, an insect symbiosis with the pollination, an insect parasitism, like it all happening on the initial parasite itself. And then, of course, you know, once the fig tree is the main tree in this system, it is then host to other epiphytic plants. Epiphytes are just trees that grow, or plants that grow on other trees. So I don't know if that's probably a sort of, well, I'm trying to remember when it's like the epiphyte is getting something out of the relationship, but it's not really harming. It's not doing damage to its host, but it's also not really providing. It's not a mutualism. It's not providing anything, but it is there.
Yeah. Oh, wait. I forgot one more relevant example, which I have to mention because we had Andrew Forbes on. So we were talking about gall wasps and how they infect trees, and then they can get infected by parasitoids. Those parasitoids, in some cases, get infected by other parasitoids. And so there are multiple layers. So Brett asked specifically for a hyperparasitoid system. You do get hyperparasitoids in the gall wasps where one parasitoid gets infected by another parasitoid. And so there, we answered one of the questions eventually.
Nice. I will say that in my experience in general, I find Atlas Obscura to do a pretty good job in their reporting. And some of my colleagues who were, you know, paleontologists like myself who have since gone on to become actual journalists have written for Atlas Obscura. So that's also a kind of a tick. I was listening to something recently that was talking about sort of how, like, you know, there's this tendency these days to either be like completely skeptical of everything you read online because anything can be fake, and just to be so hypercritical of every source and every citation and all sort of stuff. And like, I don't know, I've been thinking, it is sort of an aside, it is a tangent, but it's like, that's so much extra work and energy, and it's so much easier as humans to just have like a decent heuristic of, yeah, in general, when I, you know, like for me, what I tend to do is if I read an article that's like a paleontology article on a site like Atlas Obscura, and they by and large do a good job, get most of the details right, you know, talk to the right people, have good citations, good pictures, good explanations, I'm like, I'll generally believe that they're doing that for the other topics they cover as well. There's a podcast I was listening to, and I won't name names, but there's a podcast I was listening to a while ago, like years ago at this point, that they sort of would cover different general knowledge subjects. And I always thought it was interesting, but then whenever they would cover something like evolution or fossils or something that I actually know enough about to be considered, you know, more of an expert on, they would get all these little things wrong. It would really annoy me, and I was like, "Oh, this is irksome," because it's like you're doing your best, but it's not quite right, and it's not quite. It's not even nitpicking. It's like if you just phrase this differently or structured your sentence differently, you know, argument differently, it would actually work. And then it hit me. Oh, that's probably happening with every single topic they cover. I'm only catching it on the ones I'm the expert on. I had to stop listening to the show because I couldn't handle that heuristic sense of this is no longer a super trustworthy source. In the cognitive dissonance it provided made me not able to enjoy the show.
Yeah. No, I absolutely, like, I also have sites that I go to where I'm like, okay, this is generally reliable, or like authors where I think, oh, if they wrote on this topic, I can believe them. Like Ed Yong. Anything Ed Yong writes about, I believe it's correct.
Ed Yong. I was gonna say Ed Yong too.
Yeah, he's incredible.
We went to the same person in our brains.
Yeah, he's great. But then the problem is, if you decide that you want to read outside of your area of expertise, then you are once again in like, a no man's land where you don't know what's reliable and what's not, So like when I started reading about space, I'm like, oh, which one of these websites can you trust? And it takes a long time to get that. And so I agree. It's nice when you can have these heuristics, but sometimes it's hard to get them if you're sort of jumping between fields and want to know about a lot of things.
I mean, you can't just ask Phil and he won't tell you. You can't just give you a gut check.
I could just ask Phil, but at the same time, I need to sort of figure some of this stuff out for myself. But you're right. Phil Plate would help us out whenever we need a hand, because Phil's a great guy.
No, yeah, and obviously, and developing those heuristics yourself. Asking someone else is a nice shortcut, but there's nothing like developing that sort of search pattern is the wrong word, but sort of just the idea of how you can see the forest for the trees by being an expert, and then learning how to apply that to other stuff that you might encounter on the wide internet.
Yeah, well, Brett, thank you very much for this email. I had a lot of fun with the conversation that it sparked, and hopefully we sort of answered your questions, and enjoy your IPAs and enjoy living in Santa Cruz.
I want to go to this island. I was looking it up on Google Maps. It's kind of right where the Gulf of Bothnia meets the Baltic Sea, in between Finland and Sweden. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know where you're at, Kelly, on the whole Finland is not a real place. I personally am a Finland believer. I believe in Finland. I believe that it is real. You're not familiar with this?
I have no idea what you're talking about. I think you're crazy.
There's a whole internet conspiracy theory that Finland does not exist, that it was made up. It was made up so that the Russians would have a place to fish fish unsupervised and not have to follow any of the rules for fishing. And so they just made up this place called Finland so everyone would think there was a landmass there, so nobody would look for their illegal fishing activities.
Yet. No, I have been to Finland. I believe it exists, but it could have been a really good trip or something.
No, you think you've been to Finland.
That's right. I do think I've been to Finland, but maybe I'm crazy. Maybe not. Maybe I was in Russia going fishing.
You were actually in a part of Sweden. I think the theory says that you're in a part of Sweden where everyone just speaks Finnish or something like that.
Oh, interesting. The people I was with spoke Swedish.
Oh, there you go. It kind of gives the game away, doesn't it?
It does. Yep. They tricked me, though, at the time, but thank you for setting me straight.
Well, no, I said I personally do believe in Finland. I don't buy into the conspiracy theory, but I think we have to acknowledge that the conspiracy theory exists. So this whole parasitoid story could just be a cover-up for perpetuating the idea. But I think, if you say you've already been to Finland, but you haven't been to this island, so I think we need to do a return trip, because we got to see these butterflies in action.
That's true. Or maybe you and I are just sheeple, and when we get there, we'll discover there's no Finland, and then we'll just have to go somewhere else on vacation.
I think what was I reading? I think on this island, it's an autonomous territory of Finland, but I think I was reading that they actually do speak Swedish on this island. So we might just get into the same trouble.
It's hard to find the truth.
It's fake islands all the way down, I guess. Well, if you want us to have the resources to try to find the truth in these confusing times of deep fakes and AI and trickery and all that other stuff, you can help us in that mission by supporting us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/sciencesortof. And if you support us at the right level, which I believe is the Avogadro's Army level, then one of the kickbacks you get for that is a thesis, a BSso, a Bachelor of Science sort of honors thesis made up right here on the spot based on the stories we talked about in this episode. And this episode's thesis is going to Roberta A. So Roberta has been a longtime supporter of the show and has written in a couple of times about things going on in her life that the show had touched on, and she's one of our Patreon supporters. So we're super grateful to have her on board. So Roberta is so old school that she actually put up physical flyers for us at one point in the early days of the show. That's how hardcore we're talking about.
Oh my goodness, thank you. I remember.
Yeah.
I remember those days.
Yeah, right? So I think we got to dig deep and come up with a great thesis title. I mean, we're not really even, it's not made up. It's a real thesis title. It's just, we have to divine it from the cosmos here on the show so that Roberta knows what she's working on.
Okay, and the deal is it's supposed to be alliterative and it's supposed to be about today's show?
It can be alliterative is good. We're big fans of the fake acronym. So if we want to come up with like, if there's a project that we can make up an acronym for like VESPA or something like that, which is a wasp, something like that. So fake acronyms are always good. An unnecessary colon in the middle where you have like a sciencey sounding half a statement and then like a punny other half of a statement is also good.
Yeah, I'm trying to make wasps an acronym. Something about how many wasps there are. Wow. All species.
I don't even think I told people on the show how I did that for my own dissertation. Is now the time? Do I reveal my stupid pun title for the first chapter of my dissertation?
Yeah.
Hang on, it's opening. Where did it go? How did I lose it? I just opened the file. I think it's a long way to the top if you want to eat some leaves, because I was listening to some of the stuff from School of Rock, and it's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll. And I was like, fine, screw it. I'm so burnt out at that point. I was like, yep, we're just going with the dumb pun. So my actual dissertation title was my actual dissertation title was also a little punny as well. It was Slow Food Movements, Exploring the Dietary Ecology of Extinct and Extant Sloths Using Stable Isotope Analysis of Food Tissues and Feces.
That's really cute. I like it.
I think it was Julie that came up with Slow Food Movements. Oh yeah, no, it's all throughout. I was throwing it at the wall by the end. So the title of my introduction is Something Slowly This Way Comes. And then I think my conclusion was it's a long way to the top if you want to eat some leaves.
Titles, as you know, because you and I go through this every time we record a show together, titles just take so much work for me. It takes me forever to come up with a good title. But the paper that Andrew and I did, the Tales from the Crypt paper, that was just a beautiful thing that happened. That just happened.
Do we need to lean in that to Roberta? Has she done like an analysis based on that or like a meta-analysis? It sounded like you were coming up with something about like all the incredible number of wasp species out there.
Yeah, I have WASP written down on my paper, and I was trying to turn it into an acronym, and I just haven't slept enough for that to turn into anything yet.
I think VESPA is going to work better for us than WASP. I feel like I can come up with more sciencey words using those letters than I can with WASP. W's a tough one to start with. I feel like that's a tough opener. But like VESPA, you already got variable.
Oh, yeah.
I was thinking like variable. We got the S there for species. That's good. So what's the E?
Exceptional.
What about variable ectoparasites on species of pollinators and then something with an A?
Are awesome. VESPA.
Okay, I guess the clade. Oh, okay. Wait. Oh, hang on. Variability of ectoparasites on species of pollinating. So the genus name for bees is Apis, right? For Apidae?
Yep. Apis something.
So variability of ectoparasites on species of pollinating Apoideae, which is the so it could be something of like wasps that parasitize bees.
And there are these wasps that infect bees, and then they manipulate the bee behavior, and that what they get the bee to do is bury itself underground before it dies. And I think the deal is that by being underground, the temperature is better for the wasps. Like maybe this happens before the winter comes or something. I don't know all of the details. But there are parasitoids that go after bees and manipulate their behavior. So they're awesome.
All right. I think we are going to introduce a new style of BSso based on, we're just going to lean in to Kelly being on the struggle bus when it comes to titles. And here's what I'm pitching, Kelly. If you don't like it, you can throw it right back. Roberta's thesis title is VESPA, parentheses, the variability of ectoparasites on species of pollinating Apoidea, end parentheses, colon, a study of a very cool wasp that infects bees that manipulate bee behavior to bury themselves underground so the temperature is better or something. See the rest of the thesis for the details.
Yes. Let's lean in. I love it. That's great.
I mean, yeah, it's a BSSO. It's got BS right there in the title. So
that's right.
Roberta, there you go. That's your. It's a study of a very cool wasp that does all that stuff.
Thank you, Roberta. We really appreciate your support.
Super, super appreciate your support. If you would like to join Roberta in the Cool Kids Club at the Cool Kids table, you can do so at patreon.com/sciencesortative if you want to interact with us on social media. That's right, media that everyone can use. That's twitter.com/sciencesortative and facebook.com/sciencesortative. We have an Instagram. We haven't really done anything with it. If folks have ideas for like what we should be doing with our Instagram, hit me up, let me know, and give me ideas, because I'm not like a power Instagram user in my own life, but if there are folks who would want to see some SSO content on Instagram, I'm open to that. You can like and subscribe to us everywhere you get your podcasts, and reviews are super helpful to keeping the show discoverable on the various platforms. So anything that can be done in that sense is very helpful to us. We also, I think Kelly, you're aware of this, but if not, I'll clue you in. We also are now an affiliate of bookshop.org. So if you go to bookshop.org/shop/sciencesortative, you can see our bookshop.org page, and you can buy books, including we have an entire list of books written by people who do the show, which is currently 1 book long, but will eventually be 2 books long.
Whoa, what is the 1 book? Is that my book?
Yeah, soonish.
Okay, woo! Available at fine bookstores like Bookshop.
Right, well, that's the great thing about Bookshop, is that actually we'll deliver you the book from a local bookshop.
Nice.
So you're supporting your local book economy when you buy things through bookshop.org, and when you do it through our affiliate page, a little bit of money goes back to us as well. So we really appreciate people who do their literature purchasing through that service and leave the Amazon, the river down in South America to do its own thing. I think that's all we had for today. Andrew was awesome. Thanks for making that introduction happen, Kelly. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, Andrew is always awesome. I'm glad we got to hang out with him a bit.
And is there anything you need to plug, anything you got going on in your life that you want to find folks at home or wherever they happen to be in the world to know about?
Oh, thanks for asking. We are finishing up the details on our trivia game. Everyone thinks this game is awesome, which we kickstarted, and I think it's available on BackerKit if anybody wants a super cool trivia game. And then I'm finishing my book on space stuff with Zach, but that won't come out for another 1.5 years or so. What about you? What are you up to?
Great question. Because I had forgotten I had a few things to plug. So I've been doing a fair number of shows over on iFanboy talking about the week's comics, but I also do, whenever an animated movie comes out, we have a special group of people, the Animated Brain Trust, that get together and talk about those movies. So we have another one of those coming out pretty soon. We haven't recorded it yet, but the movie is out. It's a John Constantine Hellblazer movie. I was on the Men of Steel podcast, which is a Superman-focused podcast talking about the novel It's the Superman, written by Tom DeHaven, and which is a novel that sort of is it's written in such a way as it's the lead up to the events of Action Comics #1 from 1938, but it's actually set in that Depression era America. So, instead of growing up on a productive corn farm in Kansas, Clark Kent grew up in Dust Bowl, Kansas, and is kind of a country hayseed. And it's just a really interesting, I kind of say it's like if John Steinbeck wrote Superman. It's a really interesting novel that I don't think gets a ton of play. And it was fun to talk with the guys on Men of Steel about that. And then I was also recently on a podcast called the Retro Movie Roundtable, which is run by some buddies of mine, where they watch old movies and then talk about them, as you might imagine. And the episode that was just released was The Conversation with Gene Hackman, a movie I had never seen before, but really fantastic. One of those classic films that holds up and didn't feel like homework once I got into the story. So yeah, those are some of the podcasts I've been appearing on lately. If folks want to go see me talk about things that aren't even science. And there'll be a few more coming down the pike that I'll plug in our next episode probably.
Ooh, nice. And I should mention, speaking of podcast projects, I've been on Daniel and Jorge Explain the Universe a fair bit lately. And so if anybody wants to hear me be the ask questions because I don't know about physics person in a conversation, then head on over to Daniel and Jorge Explain the Universe.
Always fun to get to be that person from time to time.
Yeah, I got to, between Ben Tippett and Daniel Whiteson, the fact that I didn't get a degree in physics has allowed me to have very interesting conversations with people, because on both of their podcasts, I've been the guest who doesn't know about physics and asks, the every person question. And it's been fun.
But what is a black hole if not a parasite on the universe itself?
Whoa.
Right? Did I just blow your mind?
You blew my mind.
Well, with that out of the way, I will send everyone to sciencesortof.com where they can get the show notes for this episode, which will include all the links to all the other episodes that Kelly and I have been appearing in, so your feed will be full of our voices and our nonsense, and maybe even some of our sense. With that, we will wrap up this episode. Thank you so much for joining me, Kelly, and thank you all for listening. We will be back next time where we will have a whole lot more science.
Sort of.
Audio production for Science Sort of is done by Rob Heath at Rob Heath Studios. Thanks, Rob.
Visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
Sorry about the delays, guys. That was really annoying.
Yeah, it happens. I've been the delayed person on other podcasts that I've been a guest on, and I always I hate making the headache for other people, but sometimes it just happens.
There's definitely a delay. The laugh between when I said something funny and when there was the appropriate laughter was pretty long. So anyway, I'll use the hand.
Yeah, that was the delay. That was definitely delay.